And I think that Catherine is already here, Catherine Wiesner, and she has an incredible background, years of experience in the Horn of Africa, East Africa, and other regions of the Great Lakes, which I visited most of those areas, I think, Catherine, where you are. But your bio has already been posted up in chat, so if people would like to look at Catherine's background, that's fantastic. Thank you for being with us. And you have 20 minutes, and I will be timing you, and I'll just keep you posted on time. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to participate in this discussion. And what I'll do today, as UNHCR's head of external engagement for the East Horn and Great Lakes, is to provide a perspective from the UN Refugee Agency on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on asylum seekers, refugees, and internally displaced in Africa, and then to talk very briefly also about our response efforts. I should tell you at the outset that I have also invited one of my colleagues, Edith Mbolokonye Ngutia, who has joined me here today, to share my speaking time. So I know we have 20 minutes. I'm sharing some of my time with her so that she can provide with you a field perspective of the challenges that are faced by refugees in one particular camp, which is the Kakuma camp here in Kenya, where she works as a livelihoods officer. I think, as we're all aware, COVID is not a humanitarian emergency per se. It's a public health emergency, but it's having far-reaching social and economic impacts on everybody. And there are some unique vulnerabilities that refugees and other displaced persons face during this pandemic. We have actually our annual trends report coming out tomorrow. It's embargoed, but it will state that 6.3 million of the world's refugees are located on the African continent. And in the 11 countries that are covered by the regional bureau where I work, we have more than 4 million refugees and more than 8 million internally displaced persons in the Eastern Horn and Great Lakes of Africa. So this is really the hot spot for displacement. In terms of the challenges that refugees and IDPs face, of course, they live in quite crowded conditions. There are also high levels of food insecurity and malnutrition, which I think can be counted amongst reasons that make them particularly vulnerable. It's not a very old population, so in that sense, to the extent that younger people seem to be less affected by this pandemic, that is not a particular vulnerability. And we're quite fortunate that so far there have not been a large number of cases amongst refugees in our region. This may have to do with the fact that many refugees are hosted in border areas, and the connections between urban areas, the border areas, are not so as strong as we would think. But it's also mostly, I think, because of the measures that governments have taken in the region to limit restriction and to really try to slow the spread of the virus, which have been successful in that extent. But it's really just a matter of time. And so we've been working for the last few months to be as prepared as we can for major outbreaks in any number of the more than 100 refugee camps and settlements that we have in this region. We've been working really closely with governments in the region to ensure that refugees are included in their national preparedness and response efforts. This is something, the inclusion of refugees in national systems and social services has been a major advocacy point for us for quite some time, for a number of reasons around the efficiency and the sustainability. We find with the COVID-19 response, in some ways it's a little bit more straightforward because it's obviously in everybody's self-interest from a public health perspective to make sure that you don't leave anybody out. The initial focus of our preparedness and response activities has been really on awareness raising and the very basics of hygiene, hand washing, and then preparing for a health response by establishing a number of quarantine and isolation facilities around the region in concert with governments. That said, it quickly became apparent, I think, as we've been moving through these preparedness efforts, that with the social distancing and the movement restrictions, the socioeconomic impacts of this pandemic, just as they have been so grave for citizens writ large, have emerged a lot more quickly than the anticipated health impacts. And this is what Edith is going to speak to shortly. We've also done some work to try to measure this impact. We have been including refugees in some of the surveys that the World Bank is doing to measure the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19. So I'm just going to go through very briefly a few of those findings. First, in terms of food insecurity. As an example, in May and June, 70 to 80% of refugee households here in Kenya reported that they had skipped at least one meal over the last 7 days. That's compared to 41% among Kenyan households. Second is the impact of remittances. I'm sure everybody knows the heavy reliance on remittances. In fact, 74% of urban refugee households in Kampala and Uganda have reported that remittances are their main source of income. But with this crisis, fewer and fewer households are receiving remittances. In May, in Kenya, 20% of refugee households were receiving remittances. By June, only 1% said that they were still receiving remittances of any significant number. And then finally, in terms of the increase of unemployment, of course, everybody's losing jobs, but we see this disproportionately affecting refugees. They're the first to lose their jobs. So for example, in Kenya, the refugee employment rate fell from 32% before COVID-19 to 7% as of this month. So essentially what we're seeing is a reverse of all of the efforts that we've made to assimilate refugees into the labor force, and we can expect more refugees to slide into poverty in the months to come. This is particularly acute for urban refugees who don't normally receive material assistance from UNHCR, the same as is provided in camp settings, and they have suddenly lost their livelihood opportunities in a way that's created a shock for them and their families. So a number of our country operations are working to put in place these kind of one-off cash distribution mechanisms, while also advocating with governments to see where refugees can be included in emergency social safety nets that are being funded by the World Bank and other bilateral donors. Meanwhile, we have continued with our protection activities, but with necessary changes to adapt to less face-to-face interaction. Another of the key impacts, of course, is the fact that with this closure of schools, we have more than 1 million refugee students who are out of school. And efforts to connect them to distance learning obviously have a lot of hurdles with respect to the equipment that they have and their ability to connect to online or even radio classes. So we see some knock-on effects from that in the months and years to come of having so many children out of school. On the fundamental issue for refugees of access to asylum, another central focus of our global advocacy has been that even as borders are being closed, and we do see that throughout the region, that there should be ways to ensure that screening and quarantine measures can be in place for those that are truly fleeing for their lives, and that any border closures that are in place now for the sake of public health will be temporary and not become the new normal. And this is because ultimately, of course, the coronavirus has not stopped conflicts. So whether it's the Sahel, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and elsewhere, we do continue to see asylum seekers arriving across the continent, and we know that some of them are crossing borders undetected. So we've appealed for these special measures to be put in place in a practical sense. So what I'd like to do now is turn my mic over to Edith, who's gonna speak for a few minutes to share with us her unique perspectives working in one of the better known refugee camps in the region. And then I'll conclude with just a few short points. So over to you, Edith.
Thank you, Catherine. Hello, everyone. My name is Edith, as Catherine mentioned. I work in Kakuma Refugee Camp, which is a very complex operation, accommodating over around 190,000 refugees in 4 camps. Currently, because of the crisis, the refugee economy has really been hit hard, and it has really increased, reduced the refugee resilience and increased their vulnerability. In this regard, the operation quickly designed our business continuity plan, whereby we came together and set up a cash for work mechanism supported by 42 agencies. And in the process, we had to reinvent our business model, in that we are engaging currently women and young people to produce general cloth masks, about 300,000 of them. And this is actually contributing to support over 1,000 households with income, and also to ensure that the local markets continue to survive. Because with this pandemic, it means that we are experiencing challenges in terms of logistics, bringing goods to Kakuma, bringing services closer to the people. So as an operation, it's been our duty, and my duty actually, to reinforce government directives, and also to ensure that people continue earning an income. And this empowerment process has really seen refugees transition their skills to other skills so that they can remain relevant in this duration. Thank you so much. Over to you, Catherine.
Great, thank you. So just to conclude, I mean, as I mentioned before, our advocacy to have refugees included in national responses is really just the latest manifestation of the really transformative directions of refugee responses in the last decade. There was the New York Declaration in 2016, the Global Refugee Compact endorsed by all UN member states in 2018, and the vision is for refugees to be empowered as productive members of society, as Edith was saying, pursuing self-reliance, contributing to their communities wherever they are. And last December at the first Global Refugee Forum, there were many African governments who made commitments to further the inclusion of refugees in their national systems. We know that inclusion also has a cost, whether we're speaking of the health, the education, or the economic dimensions of this pandemic and its aftermath. And so we are continuing, as I noted, to make the case to the appropriate institutions, the World Bank, IMF, and bilateral donors, that governments should be supported in taking this approach when they're addressing the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. And I think that's an important advocacy and lobbying point that we welcome anybody to join us in. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Catherine, we're going to be taking the questions and answering those at the very end. Will you still be with us as we finish with our speakers, and then we're going to come back for questions?
We can do, yes.
Okay. Mary, is that all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. And is Sarah